And hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another edition of That Catholic Saints Guy. I'm your host, Brian O'Neill, and today we are going to have what I believe is going to be an incredible discussion, because the woman we're going to discuss is such an incredible woman, one of the most fascinating, compelling, and controversial figures in Catholicism over the last 100 years. That is the servant of God, Dorothy Day. And with me to discuss her is someone intimately involved in her process of beatification, Jeffrey Korgan. Jeffrey, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with me.
Thanks
well,
for having
thank
me.
you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, though, just to begin.
Sure. I'm a convert to the church. I grew up in a I guess you might say mainline Protestant denomination.
Okay.
And I left more from boredom than anything else. And when I went to Boston College, I was kind of immersed in the Catholic tradition through service learning.
Okay.
And back before there was that term, and I came into the church and felt a call to ministry, but I wanted to have a family. So I got into lay ecclesial ministry. I got a master's degree in pastoral ministry and a master's in social work from Boston College. So my first immersion in ministry was in youth ministry and social ministry.
So wait a minute, you've got two masters to your name. That means you're a really dumb guy then, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, because I couldn't get a PhD, right?
Oh, wait a minute. No, that's not what I was meaning at all. I just was joking with you.
Yeah, so I went into youth ministry and social ministry for years.
Okay.
Did a lot of work with Catholic Charities, and then I felt kind of interested in diocesan administration. It was kind of strange, there's a lot of challenges in planning at the time, and I thought I could help out. And I did that for 6 years. Probably should have done it for 5. But I have this idea that everybody in pastoral ministry should do 5 years of administration work for the church, kind of to tithe that over. But at the end of that 6 years, I really felt like I wanted to get back into pastoral ministry. And I'd learned a lot of canon law through doing parish mergers, of all things. And what I ended up getting into when I decided to open up a consulting practice was, of course, I got a lot of work with social ministry organizations, but a colleague from the Archdiocese of New York, where I'd worked for 10 years, told me that, hey, we're looking for somebody who has both the canon law background and the social ministry background who could work on the Dorothy Day cause. And so that's how I got into that. And of course, I'd always heard about Dorothy Day, but I wasn't a Catholic worker. I always felt like the absolute commitment to nonviolence was not something I had. I'm really a just war guy at the end of the day, with strict application and so forth.
Sure,
but,
absolutely.
Not a pacifist. So I always kind of got close to the Catholic worker, but never joined. But this was an opportunity to kind of celebrate the life of Dorothy Day and, use some of those things about canon law I'd learned.
And first of all, I have to admit, the little green monster is sitting slightly on my green shirt here because to be intimately involved in a canonization process or beatification process at this point is just what a fantastic opportunity with which the Lord has blessed you. But yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. She's someone that not everyone is going to agree with everything that she does, or that she did, rather, but is so compelling and so fascinating for anyone who, and challenging. That's the thing that I keep, the word that keeps coming to my mind over and over again as I learn more and more about her is how challenging she is to me. She is, and we should maybe get this out of the way, just going right up front. There's a lot of people say, why Dorothy Day as a saint? And she has this great quote, which I hope you'll share with us later. She would have said the exact same thing. I don't want people to, what is it? I don't want people to pass me over that easily or something.
Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily.
Yeah, that's a great quote. That's a great quote.
Robert Ellsberg, who's really one of the leading experts on Dorothy Day and lived with her for 5 years at the Catholic Worker, he says that he's convinced now that that is the best known quote of Dorothy Day, beyond anything she ever said about Jesus or about Christian life, about the, about nonviolence or about the, the works of mercy. Don't call me a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily is her most famous quote. And I think he would be irritated at that, actually.
But probably after you do these almost a century's worth of work, and that's what kind of people boil you down to. But what are saints? Saints are icons of Christ. And the way I put it in one of my books is that they're each like this little mosaic tile. Some are gold, some are blue, some are whatever color, but and together they may not look like much. They may just look like this little glass tile, but you put them together and they reveal an icon of Christ. And Dorothy, I think, represents in several respects many tiles, because she reflects Christ so well in so many different ways. And that, frankly, for me as a kind of a more traditional Catholic, is a little surprising to me. I'll be quite honest. Just how radical she was as a Christian, and how compelling that is for me, to the point where when I get thinking about it, sometimes I get a little emotional. So anyway, well, let's put all that aside. Why don't you start telling us their story, please?
Sure. What I always begin with is the San Francisco earthquake, the Great San Francisco earthquake.
Okay.
Because Dorothy was, I forget if she was 8 or 9 at the time, but she was a young girl, but old enough that she remembered it the rest of her life. The earthquake began. The family was living in Oakland. Her father was a very prominent sports writer, and the national pastime at the time was not really baseball; it was horse racing. And he was a very popular horse race journalist, and he settled in Oakland, and I think he worked in San Francisco, but the family lived in Oakland. So when the earthquake hit, they experienced it, but it didn't cause the kind of fires that they had in San Francisco. So San Francisco pretty much burned down.
Yes.
But Oakland just kind of went through an earthquake and then went on with things. So refugees flowed from San Francisco into Oakland by boat, by bridge, on foot, and so forth. So, Dorothy, one of her earliest memories is going around with her mother to provide basically the works of mercy to earthquake victims. And so that's a very significant part of her kind of most formative experience of her childhood. And one quote that is verified that she said to her mother, "Mother, why can't people treat each other like this all the time?" As she watched strangers helping strangers.
Oh, that's wonderful.
It's very clear to me that stuck with her the rest of her life. And when you look at her work on the works of mercy, and also her view of the role of government, because what often doesn't get talked about, and this is why some people who are more politically conservative are drawn to Dorothy, is that she did not believe in a large role for government. She believed in things like trash collection and that sort of thing. But she did not believe in like the welfare system. The Catholic Worker opposed Social Security.
That floored me. I was so surprised to see that.
Yeah, and when you described her as radical, I think you really touched on a very important word. It doesn't mean radical leftist.
No.
It means she had a radical interpretation of things like the Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. And she believed that individuals should do that, but also that there are institutions in society that maybe are like a step down from government. If you think of like churches and unions, that they were the ones who should be responding to people in need, not the government. And so when you think of it, that way, it's a very anarchist way of looking at things,
Okay.
because our traditional Catholic social teaching really does describe a very prominent role for government. But Dorothy says, no, the call of the gospel is for the individual and for churches, and and the unions play a role in that too. And the reason I connect that back to the San Francisco earthquake is that's what Dorothy saw. She saw churches and unions helping people. She didn't see the government helping people. She saw churches and unions helping people. And that really stayed with her. And I don't really, in the biographies, you don't hear a lot about that, but I'm convinced, in my study of her life, getting ready for this, that was a really key moment. So, then we just kind of fast forward ahead, and her family wasn't particularly religious. She was baptized Episcopalian, but, rarely went inside a church, except she had friends who went to church. And when she was doing a sleepover on a Saturday night, she'd go with them to church. So she had some, religious literacy, but it never really was a big part of her young life. And then when she went to college, she became involved in some socialist organizations. You can't really say anarchist organizations because that would be a contradiction, but she was influenced by some of the writing, about that. It's so interesting, thinking of the radical thing, that here's somebody, kind of drawn to anarchism, but also drawn to socialism. And, one is, privileges the government, over everything. And I think in the end, she was probably, Cardinal Dolan has mentioned this, she's probably more of an anarchist Christian than a socialist Christian, because she just, that whole role of government, she doesn't seem to believe in it. So by the time she gets into college, she's become very secular. And, she's in Illinois, and she decides she wants to be a journalist. And her father says, newsroom is no place for a girl. And, man of his times, right?
Sure.
So
no, absolutely. I get it.
You can imagine what a sports writer in the, in the 20s, in the teens, would have seen, so maybe the newsroom was no place for a girl. But
well, I laughed because, I kind of chuckled just then, because she is, would there be a Dorothy Day if she had listened to followed her father's advice? Because so much of what she did was through the written word, her journalism.
Right. And you think of it as a family business. I mean, many dads today would be very proud of their daughters being interested in their field,
Her brother Don was a journalist.
Yeah. So she, so the entire family were journalists. All the brothers became journalists too.
Right.
So she then went to New York, and she went to one mainstream newspaper after another, and they all told her the same thing. They said, newsroom is no place for a girl. And in retrospect, we know through Kate Hennessy's book that Tamar, in hearing this story, had the feeling that Dorothy's father had called these editors ahead of time and warned them that Dorothy was coming, and told them, because, on the one hand, maybe that was a common sentiment, and on the other hand, maybe that was her dad continuing to meddle. So what does someone do when they're shut out of those newspapers? She went to the alternative press. She went to the New York Call, which was a socialist paper, which of course her father hadn't called. And she kind of put herself out there and said she'd be willing to work for a very small amount of money. And the editor saw something in her and said, well, we can't afford you, but you know what, let's pay you just a few dollars to start with. And then if you stick with this for a few weeks, we'll look at bringing you up to a regular salary. And that's how it started. And so she covered the lives of the poor in New York, and went to, meetings of various movements, that were afoot at the time, and wrote about workers. And she pitched herself as a, as a girl reporter. That was the term back then. No sexism intended. It's just what they called women reporters at the time. And she pitched herself as someone who could get into places that men couldn't. So she really began to cover the family life of the poor. And then she was, there was an incident of sexual harassment at the
Really?
yeah, it was what seems to be a mentally ill colleague was constantly pestering her for dates, and she said no. And then one time they were at one of these anarchist dances. If you ever watch the movie Reds, you can see one of these. Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton go together to it. And it's a big dance that's a fundraiser for like people in jail, for their bail money and stuff.
Okay.
And she went, and this guy approached her to give her a hug, and she smacked him right in the face.
Wow.
And so her editor told her she had to apologize. And she said, I'm not going to apologize to him. And so she was fired.
Wow.
So she went to work for another radical publication called The Masses, which actually is the movie Reds is about. John Reed, the character in that, was a writer there. So she did very interesting work there, still like maybe 20 years old, doing book reviews and interviews. She interviewed Trotsky from the Russian Revolution.
No kidding.
Very interesting stuff. Now, this is all kind of the radical life. And in that, they had their hangouts, and she would hang out at this place called the Golden Swan, which had a back room called the Hellhole. And back there, there were these literary people, there were mafia leaders, there were hitmen there, and then there were these radical folks. And Dorothy got to know everyone. She got to be close to Eugene O'Neill. That's a story in of itself.
Yeah.
And she was really enjoying that life. And this is where I think you get that word, Dorothy lived a bohemian lifestyle. And I'm so glad you haven't said that word bohemian yet, because it comes up all the time. And when you think about, okay, she got together with her friends who had strong political views and had a few beers and talked late into the night about the issues of the day. I mean, how many young adults in New York City do that now? I mean, that's a pretty common, period of young adult life. So I always find that kind of irritating, the whole bohemian lifestyle. Now, that it went into a dark period. So I'm just going to share with you briefly a couple of traumas that really influenced her and part of her conversion. The first one was in the Hellhole. The owner's brother had a breakup, and he was distraught over, this woman had left him, and he drank a substantial amount of heroin and died in Dorothy's arms. Oh. And as he's dying, she looks up, and everybody except his sister had run. And what was, it was traumatizing to have somebody, commit suicide and die in your arms. But it was very disturbing to her that all these people who she'd had long conversations about building a better world just vanished when there was trouble. And including Eugene O'Neill, who was a high school friend of this poor fellow. And so that was a big challenge for her to kind of get over that trauma. And she became a nurse at that point. And this was also during the last big pandemic. And so she nursed people who had the so-called Spanish flu. And, in that time, she met another young journalist named Lionel Moyse, who was what they would say in my home state, Louisiana, something of a ladies' man. He seemed to attract women who would fall hard for him, and when he cast them aside, they would commit suicide. And it's just like a fatal attraction kind of thing. Suicide attempts, I should say. because I keep reading about different women who had dated him who tried to kill themselves afterwards. And you think, like, who is this guy? You know, there's not a
Really?
lot.
Yeah.
There's not a lot on the record about him, but he was they say he gave advice to Ernest Hemingway when Hemingway was 18 years old about writing. So he was a good writer, but he was a bad boyfriend. And
Mildly,
Dorothy
yeah.
just fell head over heels with him, and she became pregnant at some point, and he kind of did what a lot of guys have done, of say, well, you know, get rid of it. It's either the baby or me, you know, this is it. You know, you have to make a choice. And she chose Lionel. And so she had an abortion. The doctor was Emma Goldman, the famous anarchist. It was her boyfriend. And it was probably done in Chicago. And she tried to get back with Lionel, and they would be on and off again after that. But in the end, he apparently, according to Kate Hennessy, he pulled a gun on her and put a gun to her head.
Oh my!
To leave, and she just was like, okay, it's over. And so, you know, she said later, like, Lionel made me choose between the baby and him, and in the end, I lost both.
Yeah, it's tragic.
And so that's part of her whole, the whole story of her traumas, and then that led to suicide attempts, and so that it's really? I think it's not really the bohemian lifestyle, it's the traumas that put her in a very dark place. And then she,
well, you know, one thing that I was reading last night, and it was so revelatory to me, because I lived the same type of life that she did when I was a young adult. Although I'm a cradle Catholic, I, you know, had decided, like a lot of young adults, that it was better to have fun. And she talks about going from pleasure to pleasure, but the inference, and I'm paraphrasing here, you'll probably know the quote better. She goes, you know, going from pleasure to pleasure, but further away from happiness. And so, you know, given the fact that, you know, she's having these experiences without recourse or reference to grace, it's not surprising what you say.
Yeah, and she is writing, you know, 32 or 33 years later when she writes that. So it's important, I think, for anyone who really wants to take a deep dive in Dorothy's story, to read The Long Loneliness, which I think that quote comes from, but then to also read a couple of the biographies. So you kind of get a sense of, okay, there's her version of the story, and then there's what, you know, what independent people have turned up. Because like this whole period with Lionel, she says something like, you know, it was a very dark time. Of these years, there is not much to say. You know, and here's like this woman who lives this very interesting life. You get all these details of different times. And then she says, of these years, there is not much to say. The abortion, it happens during that period. So, you know, she's kind of summing up, this is a very traumatic time for me, and I don't want to talk about it. And, you know, she's free to do that. But when we look at her life as a, you know, candidate for sainthood, we need to understand the traumas that happened during that period and what she did with it. So I think Dorothy, in a way, is the original wounded healer, because she had these things happen to her, and then she wrote a book called The 11th Virgin, which she later repudiated and tried to buy every copy and burn it, unsuccessfully, of course. And it was a catharsis to kind of get over that period of Lionel, because she's basically writing about him and, you know, her life then. And after that, it got optioned for a movie. And this is like days of silent movies and these crazy things you watch today, and you can barely follow the plot. But anyway, they gave her $5,000 for the movie rights, and so she bought a little cottage in Staten Island, which might be today, you know, for us New Yorkers, we might understand it more like it was like getting a cottage on Cape Cod. You know, that's what Staten Island was like back then. You know, it
Oh,
wasn't
really? Okay.
what it is now. You know.
Yeah, I've been to Staten Island. It's not where I would think about buying a cottage, pardon me.
Yeah, no, exactly. This is like the story of the Lorax or something, you know, like but what it used to be. It used to be a land of truffula trees, and now it's urban and suburban, you know, area. Um, so Dorothy moved to Staten Island and met the love of her life, a young man named Forster, who you know, she often describes him as a biologist and an anarchist, but you know, when you look at his career, he actually ran a gauge, a company that sold gauges for machines, and he, Robert Ellsberg dryly says that his commitment to anarchism seemed to be limited to not getting married. You know, because it's like, really, you know. So but Dorothy fell hard for him, but here was a much more healthier relationship despite the, you know, the arguments about getting married. And they had a daughter together, and Dorothy often refers to him as her common law husband, which is a very interesting term, because I don't know that they were together long enough that living in the same house that common law would have kicked in, but that's her expression. She basically was saying it was like we were married, but we weren't married.
Right.
And she has Tamar, the daughter, at a time when she thought that because of the abortion that she was sterile. There were medical complications in the abortion, and she thought she would never have a child. So it was a great joy for her. And she had been attending Mass here and there. She liked the Catholic Church because it was the church of the poor. And she would attend Mass, you know, early in the morning after the hellhole and that kind of stuff. So it was like these two lifestyles were merging together. And she felt so grateful that she wanted to show her gratefulness by becoming Catholic. And that's how she became Catholic. And so it was years later that she met Peter Maurin and started the Catholic Worker. So she was not drawn into the church because of like the social teaching of the church. That came later. What she was drawn to was feeling like she was miraculously able to have a child with the man she loved. And so that's really the beginning of this whole story of her life as a Catholic. And then she really leaves that lifestyle of the single woman in New York behind and becomes kind of, you know, with living with her partner and raising her daughter. And she writes articles about the gardens of Staten Island. You know, these are really fun to look at. You can find them at the New York Public Library, where she just goes around with Tamar and visits people's gardens and writes about them for the local paper. And it's really very sweet. You know, years go by and she doesn't really find her place in the church. She feels awkward. She feels like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience. I have too, where you start going to Mass somewhere and you're just not meeting anybody. You don't feel part of the community.
Yes.
And, you know, she just was not, that time, there were not Catholics like her that had this like radical commitment to the poor and being in church. I mean, she would go to, you know, workers' rallies and socialist events and stuff. And she would say, I don't fit in with this group anymore. But then she would be in church and she'd say, I don't fit in with this group either. And so it's very hard for her. And she attends the Hunger March of 1932, which was a major demonstration of the time. That's in Washington, D.C. And she's covering it for the Catholic press. She thinks, well, okay, well, maybe I could cover this stuff for the Catholic press. So she writes articles for Commonweal in America. And then she goes to the still under construction basilica, the
Shrine of the Immaculate,
Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. Yeah, she goes there, and the crypt church is finished construction, but the exterior, the above ground part is still under construction. and she prays to Mary to help her find a way to bring her gifts to bear for the church and for the poor. Now, she gets on the bus, drives home, on the bus, and gets back to the apartment that she shares with her brother and his expecting wife. And there's this strange French guy named Peter Maurin, who says that an editor at Commonweal said they should talk. And he begins talking to her about the lives of the saints and about Catholic social teaching, and goes on and on and on. And she finally says, okay, Peter, come back tomorrow. This is too late. And so he proceeds for months to be coming to her house and teaching her about social teaching, about the lives of the saints, about, the prophets and so forth. And he becomes kind of her mentor. And then he says, I have this movement I've been wanting to start, and you're going to be the one who does it. Because he gets that he's an idea man, whatever that means. He just, he is not somebody who's going to be running a movement. He just goes on and on talking all the time. Good stuff, but he just goes on and on talking. So he's someone who is both taken very seriously out there, like in Union Square, when people would stand on soapboxes and lecture, and he would do that. He's someone who's both taken very seriously and a joke to some people about how he goes about this, just hectoring people. And so she says, okay, we'll start the movement. I could do that. One of the things she says, we'll need a newspaper. And she says, I could do that. The houses of hospitality, that came later. She says, like, we started a newspaper first, and then we kept talking about these houses of hospitality. So people started showing up, and what were we going to do? And so they started, letting people stay overnight where they were printing the newspaper. And then that grew and grew. So that's kind of that's the origin story, you might say.
Now, she was born in Brooklyn Heights. Do you know when her parents moved there? I mean, she was born there in 1897.
Yeah, but what I get is that the life of a newspaper man is it's a migrant life.
Okay.
You work on a paper, and if it's going well, you stay there. But then there's always bigger markets. So if he's a John Day, if he's a sports writer in Ohio, his dream is not to stay in Ohio forever. It's to get up to New York. So somehow there was a path that led them up to Brooklyn, but then San Francisco was looking like even greener pastures.
The reason I ask is that in the neighborhood in which she was born, that was home to the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and a famous abolitionist. And, so when you're looking for the little threads that weave into her life story and try to discern how is it that she came to have this such a passion for the downtrodden, the oppressed, etc., if maybe that had something to do with it, the family's familiarity, but it doesn't sound like there maybe really was.
No, it might be more like, 100 years from now, people will say, well, these two great people were living in Williamsburg, Brooklyn at the same time. Were they influenced? Well, that's for everybody. That's for all the cool young adults live. It's like one of those things, like they moved around a lot. And so they probably were contemporaneous with a lot of people. But I find, something I didn't mention about the earthquake. The earthquake happens, Dad grabs the two boys, and Mom grabs the baby girl, and Dorothy's still in the house.
Really?
And they get out of the house, and then the parents look at each other almost like they would in a TV show and say, well, where's Dorothy?
Home alone.
She's going through the earthquake all alone. It's still happening, and I think this is more Jeff throwing this out at you rather than scholars, but
Okay.
does it make sense that somebody would have a empathy for the people left behind, who was left behind herself as a young girl in a house when the San Francisco earthquake was happening?
It's very possible.
I put those two things together, along with seeing the works of mercy and the mediating institutions doing their work and not the government.
You know, she moved to, not long after San Francisco, she moved to Chicago, the same area that I used to live in when I lived there in Lincoln Park.
Yeah.
Were there any particularly formative experiences that she had in the Windy City?
Well, I would say walking around, because this is the days of Upton Sinclair, and the meatpacking.
Right.
So she would, one of her jobs, being a girl in a family that had a baby girl, one of her jobs was to push around the baby carriage, in the family. And she would, go all around the city, and she would see those neighborhoods, take in the smells and the sights. And so I think that influenced her. Certainly when she went off to Urbana, or Illinois, she was at the university there, Champaign-Urbana, and she studied some of these radical authors, Tolstoy, and of course she had a best friend who is buried in the Kremlin now. She became like a pretty significant young adult communist leader, and she's now buried in the Kremlin. But they were buddies, and I think Dorothy appreciated just the vibrancy of her life. So, whatever Raina was reading, Dorothy would read. And so she found it helped her make sense of the Chicago experience. So
Well, I've read that she read Upton, one of her favorite books was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
Sure.
And so that makes perfect sense, given the fact that she's not just, unlike for maybe you and me, where we're reading the book and it's interesting and we can empathize or do whatever. She knows the buildings that he's describing, and she sees the scenes that he is writing about. So that's I didn't put the two of those together. She was her family were nominal Christians, as you kind of alluded to. And yet she was this voracious reader of scripture. And I've heard that maybe her grandmother may or may not have had something to do with that. But why do you think it was that she was so captivated by the Bible?
That's a good question. I mean, part of it too is she was a very literary person.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have the catechism, but there's a literary quality to the Bible that you don't get. I mean, there's stories, right?
Right.
Jonah and the whale, and there's all these wonderful stories. And so she was very much captivated by the person and teaching of Jesus Christ, definitely. But also, I think the fact that the Bible is also a literary form, I think that really appealed to her. And then the other, and this is something that the scholars don't talk about much, but as a convert myself, I remember one time hearing a minister who worked with a lot of converts describe the haunting church, which is the church you left stays with you in the church that you come into to some degree. And the fact that she grew up nominally Protestant, I mean, she did go to church with neighbors, and she was influenced by kind of a Protestant milieu at the time. And I think she carried a little bit of that with her. So I think she, her first, her first love was Jesus in the Bible, not so much the teaching, the tradition, we might call it, or the encyclicals of the popes. Certainly a lot of papal writings about workers and social issues, but she would mention those now and then. But I think her real love was the teaching of Jesus Christ and the various stories of the Old Testament. She described herself as having been a barren woman like Sarah, who then felt God's grace. I mean, that's That's pretty powerful, and she found a great power in the scriptures.
Do you think that's what attracted her to the subject of radical Christian activism? Because I understand that that was another favorite subject for her to read about.
Well, I think it was a big part of her commitment to pacifism.
Okay.
When Jesus says, turn swords into plowshares, or Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he's saying what we need to do. He's not saying that's a nice ideal that you can aspire to get to part way. He's saying that this is a requirement of our faith, is to be peacemakers. And so that radical commitment to peacemaking was essential to her. I mean, you think of like one of her series of arrests in the 50s occurred when she and several others, including Bayard Rustin, who became the organizer of the March on Washington, they refused to go into shelters when the air raid sirens went off. There was these, you can watch films of this on YouTube.
Air raid sirens, warning them of a possible enemy onslaught. All traffic halts, and pedestrians immediately seek shelter, guided by a corps of well-trained wardens. The entire drill, lasting for only a few minutes, is carried out with precision and without complaint by New York's busy millions. Schools have been alerted, and pupils briefed on methods of protection from atomic blasts. The only surface activity is carried on by the Civil Defense Control. Reports are coordinated under the direction of Arthur Wallander, Civil Defense Director. New York silently waits. All clear. New York's first civil defense drill is a tribute to its citizens and defense organizations.
Of this kind of the duck and cover era, and the alarms go off, and everybody needs to run into, you can still see this every now and then. You walk around, you see a fallout shelter sign somewhere, an old building.
They were on my wall.
Okay, yeah, that's the thing, until you take them down and put them in your office or your room. Well, the fallout shelter, it was used in these drills. And so the air raid sirens would go off and everyone would run into a fallout shelter. Well, Dorothy and, about 20, 25 others decided that they were going to go to a park and not go in. And they were saying, we're not going to rehearse for doomsday. This is not okay. And so by 1961, there were 2,000 people doing that. But back in 1955, there were 25 people doing that. So it was a very radical thing to do, but it was a very radical application of Blessed are the Peacemakers.
You talk about her arrests in the 50s. Another time that she got arrested, and who knows, maybe even the first, was back in 1917. She got arrested as part of the Silent Sentinels, a women's suffragist group. Yeah. And it was said that she had her back repeatedly cracked over an iron bench. Yeah. And which I find interesting, first of all, that she was willing to go to jail for a right that was then later granted and which she never once used, which is the women's right to vote. But the other thing I'm wondering, did that cause any lasting health problems of which you're aware?
I'm not aware of it. I mean, definitely short term, she was in a lot of pain for a while.
Sure, who would it be?
But that whole suffrage issue, her first arrest, it's very important to go back to why did she go in the first place?
Okay.
Because, I had this same thought of, well, if she never voted, what was this all about? And it was because she had, the masses had been shut down by the federal government for sedition. That it was an anti-government, it was an anti-American publication, was what the the tax code.
So we're talking about the newspaper, not the mass as the mass, like what
No,
we're
the masses.
experiencing
No,
now.
yeah, I'm sorry. Just to clarify that, that was earlier when I was talking about John Reed and so forth.
Right.
That this was the paper, the magazine that she worked on, and it was shut down by the government. The editors were jailed. Dorothy actually got the last issue out herself. She went
Interesting.
down to the printers while the editors were jailed. They had trained her for this because they expected it to happen. But I'm sorry, what was the question again?
Well, I just was wondering, I mean, she had,
Oh, suffrage. Okay, so
yeah,
suffrage. So she's unemployed. A good friend of hers, another very vibrant woman, had just come back from a suffrage event and said to her, "I'm going down to DC. Do you want to come?" Now, how many of us have gone to a demonstration because a friend of ours said, "I'm going. Do you want to come?" I know I've gone to things before. I've gone to things that I don't even support now, but
huh,
my friend was going, and
road trip.
there's actually a very good book about leaders in the pro-life community and how they got started. And it often was that they weren't very involved in pro-life causes, but they were asked by a friend to come. A roommate said, "Hey, I'm going to this thing. You want to come?" And then they went and they were immersed in the issue. But for Dorothy, that did not happen. She went to jail and was beaten, and actually has a hunger strike. And she ended up, saying to herself, this isn't even my issue. At one point, I forget where, she writes that down. She says, like, this isn't even my issue. So, the suffrage, it's such an important part of our American history. And when people find out that Dorothy Day was arrested, they sort of assume that she was, part of this movement, but she went with a friend. And once you understand that, the fact that she never voted makes a lot more sense. It
Okay.
wasn't her issue. Her friend was the issue.
Well, and we do things for our friends all the time, and sometimes we end up wondering why, on occasion at least. So you had mentioned the fact that she was friends with the playwright Eugene O'Neill, who is a lion in terms of American literature. Maybe not as well known today, but certainly for decades he was considered this leading light in terms of American culture. Tell us about that relationship. How did it begin? What was its depth? That sort of thing.
Yeah, a very complicated relationship because Eugene O'Neill was not known for having platonic relationships with women.
Okay.
And they said that the biographies, all say that at one point he did say, "Hey, you want to sleep with me?" And she said, "No, I don't think so." And Dorothy says that he appeared to look relieved when she said that. It was so interesting. Like, I think he thought of Dorothy as his intellectual equal and got something out of the friendship. And they both felt pursued by God. And Eugene O'Neill, yeah, he used to read The Hound of Heaven in the Hellhole all the
Great
time.
poem.
And he felt like he was being pursued.
Okay.
And but yet he was utterly committed to being an atheist. So you can imagine the dissonance that set up for him of feeling like he's pursued by God but not believing in God.
Right.
And so for Dorothy, it was different. She felt pursued by God and ultimately, felt that union with God. So they had that in common, and they had lots of long walks in Greenwich Village. This is when people call it bohemian, but it sounds pretty interesting to me to be walking with Eugene O'Neill talking about God. So that's really the kind of the origins of that friendship, and it was damaged by that trauma of the overdose because she was so disappointed that Gene ran.
Okay.
Here's a high school friend of yours, Gene, and he ODs because he's distraught over a relationship with a woman, and you run like everyone else. you know. And so she confronted him about that, and then they were kind of, you know, not friends for a while. But then she forgave him and became friendly with him again. But it wasn't like it was in the beginning when they go on those long walks and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and which often happens. So in 1921, she has the abortion, which she calls the great tragedy of her life. And what impact do you think that had, both in terms of just her general worldview and her journey into the Catholic Church? Now, what we need to understand, I just for the viewer's sake, is that up until the 1960s, abortion was pretty much illegal in most places, and the Catholic Church made probably more of an issue about contraception, which was a percolating issue at the time, and abortion was roundly understood as being illicit, not something that should be legal. And that was throughout all strata of society, doctors, lawyers, etc. So it wasn't so much that, wow, the Catholic Church is pro-life, I would imagine. I'm going to go to this because I've had this experience and it draws me to it. I'm thinking there may have been something else with respect to abortion that might have attracted you to Catholicism. But anyway, to speak a little bit about the abortion, if you would, I guess.
Yeah, and the fact is, you know, her writings on that consists of these years. There is not much to say. You know, we've managed to piece together some of the details from other sources, and she did confide this information to a couple of Catholic workers in the 1970s, very late in her life. So we do know some of the details. We know it was Dr. Benjamin Reitman, who was known as a hobo doctor in Chicago, who was in a relationship with Emma Goldman. We don't know, we can't connect those dots without making kind of inferences that I'm not sure that we have the right to make.
Okay, fair enough.
There are some people that feel like, you know, the psychobiography, you know, of Dorothy Day might be the Catholic worker was her act of penance for that abortion. Some people, you know, look at it that way. She did not like to talk about it, and actually she signed on. You know, there's a document right after Roe versus Wade, and she signed on as someone who said that this is wrong, and you know, abortion should not be legal. She did do that, but as far as taking it on as like an issue like peace, she never did. And I get the sense, looking over her life and, you know, reading so much that she wrote and that she confided in people, that it was really painful. It was something she had a lot of regret about and did not want to dwell on it. There's a letter in that collection, you know, you might take a look. There's a letter in this, I think the 1970s, to a young woman who had just had an abortion, and it's a very pastoral letter. And only someone who had gone through that and felt the pain of that could write about it.
Well, and she talks about the literal pain, the physical pain that she experienced, this burning in her abdomen and that sort of thing. A few years later, in 1924, she wrote, "I thought I was a free and emancipated young woman and found out I wasn't at all. Freedom is just a modernity gown, not maternity, sorry, modernity gown, a new trapping that we women affect to capture the man we want," which is going to raise some eyebrows because that's kind of an interesting statement. So what do you think she meant by that?
Oh, I think she was talking about her and Lionel.
Okay.
And then universalizing it. Because remember, he said, you know, you got to make a choice, either me or the baby. And she chose him and then lost him. So, you know, I think she was, you know, she was still hurting from that.
Absolutely. I don't doubt. I mean, he wasn't the great lover of her life, as you indicated, but he still had a huge impact on her, as I guess he did a lot of people. Wow. At the same time as she's writing this, she is getting closer and closer to Catholicism, and it's becoming a great source of comfort and joy to her. And yet it was also a driving her apart from the man who was the father of her child, Tamar. And what is that accurate to say? What can you say about this? Tell us about this.
Well, it's back to his very strongly held belief about not getting married, that the state had no role in marriage, and he never married. You know, he had another partner who he was with for, you know, decades, but he never married, and that was a strongly held belief for him. And with for Dorothy, you know, she'd just come into the church, and she feels like this is important. So it's almost a tragedy to have two people so in love, but so principled, you know, that they cannot figure out a middle ground. And Dorothy gave him a lot of chances, a lot of, you know, she would change the terms. She would say, you don't have to go to church with me. It's fine that you're not interested, but you gotta let me be me, and you gotta get married. And he wouldn't accept that. And I wonder sometimes if he regretted that at some point.